Grant Whitlock stood across from his mother in the old family study, his hands braced against the desk that had once belonged to his father. "Mom, if Bianca finds out we know, she'll move before we can stop her." Harriet Whitlock studied her son. "Then she doesn't find out. You want me to go back to her? I want you to go home to your wife." Harriet closed the folder between them. "Be good to her. Have dinner with her. Listen to her. And stop acting as though you're the only person who's been wronged." Grant's jaw tightened. "After what she's done? You've done plenty yourself." He said nothing. "If there's still a marriage worth saving, Grant, I want you to save it." "And if there isn't?" Harriet looked toward the hallway beyond the study. This house had belonged to the Whitlock family long before Grant was born. "If she chooses this family, she stays." She turned back to him. "If she chooses what I think she's choosing, then when the time comes, you will ask her to leave my house." Grant looked at the closed folder again. Neither of them understood yet how many pieces of his life had already changed hands. "Hello, my friends. I'm Eleanor Brooks. If stories about family, truth, and second chances mean something to you, subscribe and stay with me." Because 4 months earlier, Grant Whitlock still looked like a man who had everything under control. At 44, Grant ran the company his parents had spent most of their adult lives building. His father, Warren, had taught him operations. Harriet had taught him people. And Grant had been good at both. After Warren passed, Harriet stepped away and handed day-to-day control to her son. Then she returned to the old Whitlock house outside Richmond, Virginia. It wasn't a mansion. It was simply home. 3 generations of family photographs lined the staircase. Thanksgiving meant folding tables in the dining room. Christmas meant grandchildren sleeping upstairs and somebody always forgetting where the extra blankets were kept. Warren used to say a business could give a family money, but a home gave them somewhere to remember who they were. For years, Grant seemed to understand that. Then, one October evening, he showed up after 9. Harriet made coffee. They talked for an hour. Grant slept in his old bedroom. A week later, he did it again. Then twice the following week. By November, Harriet had stopped believing he was simply lonely for his father. One evening, Grant stood at her kitchen counter and said casually, "Bianca and I have been talking. Maybe we should move in here for a while." Harriet set down her coffee. "Why?" "To help you out. Keep an eye on things." Harriet almost smiled. She still drove herself to the grocery store. Managed her own accounts. Climbed the stairs every night without assistance. Her son knew that. She watched him avoid her eyes. "Grant." He looked up. "What are you running from?" For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down. "Mom." His voice had changed. "I owe money." Grant kept his eyes on the kitchen table. Harriet waited. She had spent enough years in business to know that when someone finally admitted there was a problem, interrupting usually made them retreat. "How much?" she asked. Grant rubbed both hands over his face. "Enough. That isn't a number." "I know." He got up, walked to the sink, then came back without doing anything. Harriet had seen him negotiate contracts worth millions without losing his place in a sentence. Watching him struggle to answer one simple question told her more than the answer probably would. "It started with sports betting," he said. Harriet said nothing. "Nothing crazy at first. A few $100s on weekends. Then I had a good run." "And you thought you were good at it?" Grant gave a tired little laugh. "I thought I was smarter than everybody else." That sounded more like her son. He explained how a few wins became larger bets. When the losses came, he tried to recover them instead of stopping. Then he started putting personal money into speculative stocks and small companies people around him swore were about to take off. Some did well. Others didn't. 2 collapsed completely. "So you lost money twice," Harriet said. First betting. Then trying to repair the betting. Grant nodded. And you told Bianca? Eventually. Harriet leaned back. Eventually is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Grant looked down. She found out before I was ready to tell her everything. That mattered, but Harriet wasn't ready to blame Bianca for it. Your wife had a right to be angry. I know. She had a right to protect herself and the children. I know that too. Harriet studied him. There was shame in his face, but something else sat underneath it. Fear. Are you still betting? No. Grant. No, Mom. Not now. Not now. Harriet noticed the wording and stored it away. Then she asked the question that had been bothering her since he first said he owed money. Whitlock Industrial Supply was profitable. Grant earned a strong salary. He received distributions. He owned assets. The company had survived recessions, supply shortages, and Warren's death without missing payroll. Harriet knew because she still received quarterly reports. So why are you sleeping here? Grant looked at her. If you owe personal debt, deal with it. Sell something. Cut your spending. Use your distributions. His expression changed. Harriet caught it immediately. What? I can't. She frowned. Can't or won't? Grant stared at the table. I can't use the distributions. Why not? A long silence settled between them. Then Grant said quietly, because I don't control them anymore. Harriet didn't move. This was no longer just a story about a son who had lost money. How, she asked, does the man running our family company lose control of his own money? Grant didn't answer right away. Harriet could hear the refrigerator humming behind her and the old wall clock ticking above the pantry door. Finally, Grant said, it started after Bianca found out about the betting. Harriet folded her hands. That doesn't answer my question. She didn't trust me with money anymore. Did you blame her? No. That answer came quickly. Grant explained that Bianca had first taken control of their household accounts. She changed passwords, lowered limits on joint cards, and insisted that any large personal expense be discussed first. Harriet listened without interrupting. So far, she said, I'm on her side. Grant gave a small nod. So was I. That was why he had agreed when Bianca suggested putting stronger safeguards around his company distributions. At first, Grant still received the same income. He simply couldn't move large amounts without a second approval. Then the rules changed again. Some distributions were redirected. Certain withdrawals required additional signatures. A portion of his ownership interest was moved into a new structure Grant said was supposed to protect the business from his personal creditors. Harriet's expression tightened. You moved ownership? Not the company. Not exactly. Grant, either you moved something or you didn't. I signed papers. There it was. Not Bianca made me. Not someone tricked me. He had signed them. Harriet leaned back. Did you read them? Most of them. Most? Grant looked away. Harriet felt the disappointment before the anger. Warren had spent years teaching their son never to sign anything he couldn't explain afterward in plain English. Grant knew better. You were running the company when you signed these? Yes. And you understood that your rights were changing? I understood some restrictions were being added. That's not what I asked. Grant exhaled. No. I didn't understand how far it would go. The room went quiet again. Harriet could see the shape of the problem now, but not its edges. Bianca had every reason to stop a husband who was making reckless decisions with money. What Harriet couldn't understand was why protecting Grant from himself required changing his ownership rights. Who prepared the documents? Bianca handled most of that. She isn't a corporate attorney. No. Then who helped her? Grant hesitated. A consultant. Harriet waited. Nolan Pierce. The name meant nothing to her. What kind of consultant? Restructuring. Asset protection. He came highly recommended. By whom? Grant's eyes dropped for just a second. Bianca. Harriet reached for a yellow legal pad beside the fruit bowl and wrote down the name. Nolan Pierce. Then she looked at her son. Tomorrow, you're going to show me every document you signed. Grant nodded. Harriet tapped her pen once against the paper. Because one question was beginning to bother her more than all the others. If Bianca had only wanted to stop Grant from losing money, why had someone started changing who controlled it? By 10 the next morning, Grant was back at his mother's house with a laptop and a banker's box. They worked in Warren's old study. Harriet sat behind the desk while Grant pulled up agreements, amendments, and account statements. Some were familiar. Others carried names Harriet had never seen. At first, the changes looked almost reasonable. After Grant's gambling losses became known, Nolan Pierce had recommended separating Grant's personal risk from the company. Harriet could understand that. Whitlock Industrial Supply employed more than 80 people. Nobody's paycheck should depend on whether her son made another foolish decision on a Sunday afternoon. Nolan's first recommendation required a second approval before Grant could take unusually large distributions. Then came another change. Certain ownership interests were moved beneath a holding company. Then another. Cash reserves were separated from personal distributions. Then a family fund appeared. Harriet stopped Grant. Go back. He scrolled up. There. She pointed at the screen. Who controls that? Grant read the paragraph again. Bianca and I were both supposed to. Supposed to? There were amendments later. He opened another file. The language was dense, but Harriet had spent 35 years sitting across tables from bankers, vendors, accountants, and attorneys. She didn't need to understand every legal phrase to recognize a pattern. Grant needed approval to move money. Bianca didn't always need his. Grant's voting authority had conditions. Other people had been given roles he could not remove by himself. Harriet looked at him. You agreed to this? Not all at once. That wasn't my question. Grant rubbed the back of his neck. Yes. Harriet said nothing. He continued. Nolan told us the structure had to be strong enough that I couldn't undo it the first time I panicked. And you thought that made sense? At the time? Yes. Harriet did too. That bothered her. A bad arrangement was easy to recognize when it looked bad from the beginning. This one hadn't. It had arrived one sensible step at a time. Harriet turned back to the screen. Show me the family fund. Grant opened another document. Harriet read the names twice. Then she looked at her son. Grant, who are these people? Bianca's brother is one. And the others? One works with her family's investment group. Another is an outside trustee. Harriet leaned back slowly. Nolan Pierce had supposedly built a wall around the Whitlock company to protect it from Grant. But somehow, on the other side of that wall, Bianca's family had ended up holding the keys. Harriet closed the laptop halfway. I understand why someone took the matches away from you. Grant lowered his eyes. What I don't understand, she continued, is why they handed them to your wife's family. Grant had no answer. And for Harriet, that was the first moment the paperwork stopped looking like protection and started looking like something else. For the next 2 days, Harriet kept returning to the same question. Was Bianca controlling Grant? Or had Bianca simply done what Grant had been unable to do for himself? The records did not give Harriet an easy answer. There had been a time when Grant tried to pull nearly $90,000 from a personal distribution account. Bianca stopped it. 3 weeks later, he tried again. She stopped that too. Harriet looked across Warren's old desk. What was that money for? Grant didn't answer. Grant. I thought I could recover what I'd lost. Harriet's face hardened. You were going to bet it? Some of it. She closed the statement. Then Bianca was right. Grant nodded. Harriet wasn't interested in making her son innocent just because he was her son. Bianca had protected their household. She had protected the children. She may even have protected the company. But then Harriet found something she couldn't explain. Grant's personal debt had not been paid down the way he believed it would be. Large payments had gone out, but much of the money had covered interest, fees, and short-term obligations. The principal barely moved. You knew this? Harriet asked. Not at first. Why didn't you insist they pay it down? Grant gave her a tired look. With what authority? That answer stayed with her. Grant was earning money. His company was earning money. Yet he remained just financially stable enough to keep going, while the debt stayed around his neck. Then Grant admitted the part he had been avoiding. 6 months earlier, convinced he could fix everything himself, he borrowed money outside the family accounts. He placed one enormous wager. Harriet stared at him. You did what? I thought if I won, I could clear enough debt to get control back. And? Grant looked away. He didn't have to answer. Harriet stood and walked to the window. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, she turned. Bianca didn't make you place that bet. I know. Nolan didn't make you do it. I know. You did. Yes. Harriet sat down again. That mattered. Whatever else she discovered, she would not rewrite her son's mistake simply because she loved him. But another question had begun to trouble her. If Bianca wanted you out of debt, Harriet said, why keep paying enough to prevent a crisis without ever paying enough to free you from it? Grant looked at her. I've asked myself that. And what did she say? That I hadn't earned the right to control my own money yet. Harriet glanced back at the statements. Maybe Bianca was right. Maybe she wasn't. But Harriet had spent too many years in business not to recognize leverage when she saw it. And Grant's debt was starting to look less like a problem Bianca wanted solved. And more like a problem someone needed to keep alive. 3 nights later, Grant came back after dinner. This time, he didn't bring paperwork. He stood in the study doorway with his coat still on. Mom, I think Bianca is seeing someone. Harriet didn't react immediately. What makes you think that? Grant sat across from her. Late dinners that never appeared on her calendar. A hotel charge Bianca said belonged to a client meeting. Calls she took outside. Her phone suddenly staying face down whenever Grant entered the room. None of it proved anything by itself. Together, it had changed the way he looked at his marriage. Have you asked her? No. Why? Grant gave a humorless laugh. Because I'm not exactly standing on solid ground. At least he understood that. Then he told Harriet what he wanted to do. Leave Bianca. Walk away from Whitlock Industrial Supply. Start another company somewhere else. I know how to build a business, Mom. Dad taught me. You taught me. I can start over. Harriet shook her head. No, Grant blinked. No? You've been starting over every time something becomes painful. You lost money, so you tried to win it back. You lost control, so you borrowed more. Now your marriage is falling apart, and you want another company. What am I supposed to do? Go home. He stared at her. To Bianca? To your wife? After everything I just told you? Harriet leaned forward. You lied to her about money. You gambled again after promising you wouldn't. You signed documents you didn't understand. You gave her reasons not to trust you. Grant looked down. If there's still a marriage worth saving, I want you to save it. Be good to her. Be honest. Give her a reason to remember why she married you. And if she really is doing what I think, then we'll deal with facts when we have facts. The next afternoon, Harriet met Graham Sutton, the attorney who had advised the Whitlocks for nearly 20 years. She expected complications. She did not expect his conclusion. Graham spent nearly 3 hours reviewing the structure Nolan Pierce had created. Finally, he removed his glasses. "Harriet, I have bad news." Her stomach tightened. "Most of this is valid." Grant signed it. "The approvals are documented. The fund has independent controls. We can't simply unwind it because he regrets the arrangement." "So Bianca really has this much control?" "Yes." Harriet looked at the ownership chart spread across his desk. For the first time, she felt the door closing. Then Graham tapped one section with his pen. "The troubling part isn't that Bianca has control." Harriet looked up. "What is it?" Graham's expression changed. "It's how professionally someone made sure she would." For the next 2 weeks, Grant did exactly what Harriet had asked. He went home every night. He cooked dinner twice, something Bianca joked he hadn't done since their youngest was in grade school. He took her out on Saturday. He stopped checking her phone when she left it on the counter. More importantly, he stopped defending himself. When Bianca brought up the money he'd lost, Grant listened. When she told him she no longer trusted his judgment, he didn't argue. For a few days, Harriet wondered if she'd been right to send him back. Maybe there was still something there worth saving. Bianca seemed different too. She laughed more. One Sunday morning, Harriet watched her reach across the breakfast table and straighten Grant's collar before church. It was such an ordinary, affectionate little gesture that Harriet found herself wondering whether suspicion had made all of them see shadows where there were none. Then the Whitlocks' house sold. Bianca told Harriet the move would simplify everything. Lower expenses. Less pressure. A chance for Grant to get himself steady again. Until they found another place, Bianca suggested that she, Grant, and the children move into Harriet's house. Harriet agreed. A week later, boxes filled the upstairs hallway. At first, Bianca was almost grateful. She helped with dinner. Bought groceries. Asked Harriet whether she needed anything from town. Then small things changed. Bianca suggested replacing the dining room table because it was too old-fashioned. She measured the upstairs guest room without asking. One morning, Harriet heard her discussing paint colors with Grant. Another afternoon, Bianca stood in the hallway looking at the family photographs. "When this is Grant someday," she said, "we'll probably have to modernize some of this." Harriet smiled. "Someday is a long way off." Bianca smiled back. "Of course." Harriet said nothing more. She cooked. Folded towels. Picked up her grandchildren from school once. She let Bianca see exactly what Bianca expected to see. A 69-year-old widow enjoying having family around again. But Harriet had not stopped asking questions. Graham recommended a private investigator named Trent Maddox to look quietly into the sale of Grant and Bianca's house. 3 days later, Trent called. "I've got the closing records." Harriet stepped onto the back porch so nobody inside could hear her. "Anything unusual?" "The sale price." The house had gone for nearly $70,000 below what comparable properties in the neighborhood suggested it should have brought. Harriet frowned. They needed money quickly. That was my first thought. And? They didn't. Harriet gripped the phone a little tighter. Trent continued. "There was another offer." "How much?" "Higher." Harriet went still. "Then why didn't they take it?" "I don't know yet." Through the kitchen window, Harriet could see Bianca laughing with Grant as she unpacked dishes into cabinets that had belonged to Warren's mother. Trent spoke again. "But I can tell you this. They didn't sell cheap because they had no choice." Harriet watched Bianca place another plate on the shelf. For the first time, the sale of that house no longer looked like an escape from debt. It looked like someone had wanted a particular buyer to get it. Trent called Harriet the following afternoon. "I found the buyer." Harriet stepped into Warren's study and closed the door. Who? Technically, an LLC called Cedar Ridge Holdings. That tells me nothing. It was probably meant to. Trent had followed the public filings from Cedar Ridge to a management company, then to another business entity registered outside Virginia. Harriet listened, writing each name on a yellow legal pad. 3 companies. 2 addresses. 1 registered agent. Then Trent said a name she already knew. Nolan Pierce. Harriet's pen stopped. The restructuring consultant? The same one. She looked toward the closed study door. Are you telling me Nolan bought Grant's house? I'm telling you there's a financial connection between Nolan and the company that bought it. I want to be careful about saying more until I have the full trail. Harriet appreciated that. Facts first. Always. That evening, she watched Bianca across the dinner table. Bianca asked the children about school. Passed Grant the potatoes. Complained about traffic on Interstate 64. Nothing about her suggested she had helped sell her own house below market value to a company connected to the man who had restructured her husband's business interests. Grant didn't know yet. Harriet kept it that way. 2 days later, Trent returned with more. There were repeated meetings between Bianca and Nolan that had nothing to do with Whitlock Industrial Supply. Restaurant reservations. Travel dates that matched Bianca's unexplained absences. A weekend Grant thought she had spent visiting an old college friend. None of those details alone would have settled the question. Together, they did. Harriet called Grant to the study after everyone went to bed. She gave him the information without dressing it up. Grant read it twice. Then a third time. So I was right. Harriet shook her head. You suspected. That's different. He sat down in his father's chair. For a moment, Harriet saw the boy who used to come into that same room after he'd broken something and hoped Warren could fix it. But this wasn't something a father could glue back together. Then Harriet noticed another page in Trent's report. A name. She had seen it before in Grant's old records. Who is Marcus Vale? Grant looked up. He introduced me to some of the people I invested with. Harriet slid the page toward him. Trent had found business connections between Marcus and companies within Nolan's professional network. Grant's face changed. That's not possible. Harriet didn't answer. The affair was painful. The house sale was worse. But this was something different. Nolan Pierce had not simply appeared after Grant's financial problems began. His network may have been somewhere near Grant before the family fund was ever created. Harriet closed the report. Now the question wasn't whether Nolan had taken advantage of Grant's weakness. It was how long he had known that weakness was there. Grant spent most of the next morning in Warren's study with the old corporate records spread around him. This time, Harriet wasn't leading him through them. Grant was leading her. He remembered which board meetings had run late. Which agreements had been revised. Which documents had arrived from Nolan's office after Grant thought the terms were already settled. Around noon, he stopped on one amendment. Wait. Harriet looked up. Grant read the page again. Then he pulled an older version from the box. This isn't the document I signed. Harriet came around the desk. Your signature is right there. Grant studied the page again. The signature may be mine. This version isn't. He pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. This provision wasn't in the version I approved. And that provision mattered. It changed how certain voting rights could be exercised if Grant was considered financially impaired. Harriet called Graham. An hour later, the attorney was sitting with them. He compared the drafts, dates, signature pages, and email records Grant still had. This doesn't prove anything by itself, Graham said. Grant nodded. But? Graham tapped the final amendment. But it's the first thing I've seen that gives me a reason to question how part of this structure was authorized. Harriet felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not relief. Leverage. Then the front door opened. Bianca came home early. She entered the study carrying a thick folder. Her eyes moved from Harriet to Grant, then to Graham. For half a second, nobody spoke. Bianca smiled. Good. You're all here. She placed the folder on Warren's desk. I was going to wait until tonight, but this can't wait. Grant opened it. The first pages were financial statements from Whitlock Industrial Supply. His expression changed almost immediately. These numbers aren't right. They're current, Bianca said. Graham reached for the report. There were liabilities Grant hadn't expected. Outstanding obligations. Years of losses and charges presented in a way that made the company look far weaker than the operating reports Harriet had been seeing. Grant flipped through the pages faster. Where did this come from? From the mess we've been trying to keep contained. Bianca's voice stayed calm. If this isn't handled soon, it won't just be the company paying for it. Harriet watched her carefully. What does that mean? It means Grant's position could become very difficult. Grant looked up. Bianca didn't look away. Harriet rested one hand on the folder. What are you asking us to do? Bianca glanced toward the study windows, then around the room Warren had used for almost 30 years. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet. There is one asset large enough to give us room to fix this. Harriet already knew what Bianca was looking at. Still, she made her say it. Which asset? Bianca met her eyes. This house. Bianca kept one hand on the folder. Harriet looked at her, then at Grant. Sell this house? Temporarily change where the money is sitting, Bianca said. That's all. Harriet almost smiled at the wording. People in business had 100 gentle ways to describe giving up something valuable. Bianca opened the folder and turned to a summary page. The company needs liquidity. We sell this place, buy something smaller for all of us, and use the difference to stabilize the business. Once everything is cleaned up, we can rebuild. Rebuild what? Harriet asked. Our finances. No. I mean this house. Bianca paused. We can always buy it back later. Grant looked at his wife. You know that's not how this works. Then give me another option. I need time to verify these numbers. We don't have time. Bianca tapped the report. If this exposure gets worse, you could lose more than the company. Harriet kept her voice even. How much more? Bianca looked at Grant before answering. His freedom could become part of the conversation. The room went quiet. Harriet felt the words land exactly where Bianca intended them to. On a mother's fear. Grant pushed his chair back. Don't use that on her. I'm trying to protect you. Then let me see the underlying records. You've had years to manage things properly. Harriet raised one hand. Both stopped. She looked at the photographs on the study wall. Warren at 38. Grant on his first day at the company. 3 generations standing on the front porch one Thanksgiving. Then she looked at Bianca. All right. Grant turned sharply. Mom. Harriet didn't look at him. If selling this house is what keeps the family from losing everything, I'll consider it. Bianca's shoulders relaxed. Just slightly. But Harriet saw it. That night, after Bianca went upstairs, Grant returned to the study with Graham. Harriet locked the door. Now, she said, tell me what those numbers actually mean. Grant worked through the report line by line. Within 20 minutes, he found the first problem. A management charge he didn't recognize. Then another. Payments to related entities. Consulting obligations that didn't match normal operating expenses. Graham wrote down each company name. By midnight, one name had appeared more than once in the ownership trail. Nolan Pierce. Graham leaned back. I need Trent to trace these entities before we say anything. Harriet nodded. Then Graham looked at the folder Bianca had left behind. Harriet, I don't think Bianca needs your house to save the company. Harriet's eyes stayed on the financial report. Then why does she need it? Graham closed his notebook. That, he said, is what we need to find out. 2 days later, Trent called just after 7 in the morning. I found the connection. Harriet carried the phone into Warren's study and shut the door. Tell me. The company that had expressed interest in buying the Whitlock house was separated from Nolan Pierce by 2 business entities. On paper, there was distance. In practice, Trent said, the same people kept appearing. The same mailing address. The same management company. The same financial advisor. And eventually, Nolan. But Trent had found one more connection. Marcus Vail had been doing referral work with businesses tied to Nolan before Grant ever met Nolan as a restructuring consultant. There was no proof Nolan had caused Grant's gambling problem, and Harriet refused to pretend there was. Grant had made those choices himself. But Nolan's network had been close enough to Grant's financial troubles that Harriet could no longer dismiss the possibility that someone had recognized his weakness long before Bianca brought Nolan into the company. Harriet sat behind Warren's desk. Grant had created his own weakness. And somewhere along the way, someone had learned how to use it. So Bianca sells Grant's house below market to a company connected to Nolan. Then she tells me my house has to be sold, and another company connected to Nolan is waiting nearby. That's what the records suggest. Harriet thanked him and called Graham. By noon, Graham and Grant had enough to begin challenging the disputed amendment and several related transactions. But Graham warned them not to celebrate. This isn't a magic switch, he said. We can challenge the authorization. We can raise the conflicts. We can demand records. But Grant still has to answer for the decisions he actually made. I will, Grant said. Harriet looked at her son. For once, he didn't sound ashamed. He sounded ready. That afternoon, Bianca joined them in the study. The sale folder was already on Warren's desk. Bianca sat across from Harriet. We need a decision. Harriet folded her hands. Before I give you one, I want to ask you something. Bianca waited. Is there anything you want to tell Grant? A small silence followed. About what? Anything you think he deserves to hear from you before I sell the home his grandfather left this family. Bianca glanced at Grant. No. Harriet gave her one more moment. Bianca didn't take it. Grant opened another folder. I did plenty wrong, Bianca. Her eyes shifted toward him. I gambled. I hid losses. I signed documents I should have read twice. That's mine. He placed the disputed amendment on the desk. But this isn't. Then came the ownership trail from their former house. The related party charges. The Nolan connections. And finally, the company's position to benefit if Harriet sold her home. Bianca looked at the papers, then at Grant. You were drowning. Somebody had to make decisions while you were busy pretending you weren't. Grant held her gaze. Protecting me wasn't the problem. Building something I could never escape was. Bianca's expression changed. Only slightly. But the confidence was gone. Harriet watched her carefully. I told Grant something weeks ago, she said. I told him that if there was still a marriage worth saving, he should save it. Bianca said nothing. I also told him that if you chose this family, you could stay. Harriet pushed the sale folder back across the desk. There will be no sale. Bianca stood. You don't understand what you're risking. No, Harriet said quietly. I finally understand what you were asking me to risk. Grant rose beside his wife. For a moment, Harriet wondered whether he could actually do it. Then he looked at Bianca. I made the mistakes that opened the door. His voice remained steady. But that didn't give anyone permission to take everything through it. He stepped toward the study door and opened it. Bianca, you need to leave my mother's house. And this time, Grant didn't look to Harriet to rescue him from what came next. Bianca left the Whitlock house that evening with 2 suitcases. Grant did not follow her. He stood at the front window until her car disappeared down the driveway, then went into Warren's study and sat alone. Harriet let him. Some lessons didn't need a mother standing nearby. The weeks that followed were quieter than the confrontation. Graham challenged the disputed amendment and requested a formal review of the related transactions. Once questions were raised about authorization and undisclosed financial connections, the structure that had looked impossible to touch no longer looked quite so permanent. The proposed sale of Harriet's home stopped immediately. Several company charges tied to outside entities were reviewed. Nolan Pierce was removed from any further role in Whitlock business affairs while Graham and outside advisors reviewed the transactions connected to him. But Harriet refused to turn that into an excuse for her son. One morning, Grant sat across from her at the kitchen table. "If we recover enough from this, I can clear the rest of my personal debt." Harriet shook her head. "No." Grant looked surprised. "I'll help protect what belongs to this family," she said. "I won't erase what you did to yourself." He understood. Grant entered a recovery program for his gambling problem. He reduced his personal expenses and worked with Graham and the company's advisors to rebuild safeguards that protected the business without giving one person unchecked control. His marriage did not survive. Bianca had been given opportunities to explain herself and decide whether there was still a marriage worth saving. In the end, she made her choice. Harriet was sad about that. Not because she wanted Bianca back under her roof, but because children had lost the family they once knew. A year later, Thanksgiving returned to the Whitlock house. The dining room table Bianca had once called old-fashioned was still there. So were the photographs on the staircase. Grant stood at one end of the table carving the turkey in the same place Warren used to stand. Harriet watched her grandchildren argue over dinner rolls and smiled. Later, her youngest granddaughter found her near the fireplace. "Grandma, are we always going to have this house?" Harriet looked around the room. She had since placed the property under stronger protections. No frightened son, persuasive spouse, or single signature could easily turn it into someone else's opportunity. "As long as this family remembers what it's for," she said. And perhaps that was what Harriet had been protecting all along. Not wood. Not land. Not even money. A place where people could come home without believing that coming home gave them the right to own everything inside it. "My friends, Eleanor Brooks here again." Harriet gave her son something more valuable than an easy rescue. She gave him a chance to take responsibility, repair what he could, and finally stand on his own. She also gave Bianca every opportunity to choose her family before closing that door. What do you think? Did Harriet give Bianca too many chances, or would you have done the same to try to keep your son's family together? Tell me what you would have done in Harriet's place.